everyone, good evening, and welcome to Gluskin Ireland House NYU. Tonight is very special. It marks our first in-person event since March 2020, so we are absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to the house this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the Gluskin House faculty, staff, student workers who just started this week, and of course our advisory board for all their work and effort in getting us to tonight. The past years have most definitely been a time of uncertainty, and it's really, truly exciting for us to gather together as a community once again. On that note, I'd like to especially thank all of you for your consideration and continued support in making this a safe and energizing evening. Please note that while masks are not required, you're welcome to wear one if you are more comfortable doing so. Some of you may have noticed some changes to Ireland House, the physical appearance of the space. We are in the midst of wrapping up a refurbishment that kind of took place over the summer. So please note that the downstairs area is not open. And as such, we won't be holding a reception following this event, but we invite you to continue conversations and discussion at the White Oak Tavern just around the corner on Waverly Place. Finally, I'll just ask that you make sure that all cell phones are on silent. And I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Dr. Peter Hessian, who has just joined Ireland House as faculty fellow this fall. Peter comes to us from University College Dublin, where he has been the Newman Fellow in Irish History. He is a social historian with a focus on the material cultures of 19th century Ireland. And he will introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. James Stafford. So Peter, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and a very warm welcome to everybody here. It's obviously a very great pleasure to welcome people back for our first in-person event here at Gluskin Ireland House. And it's an enormous pleasure for me personally to also be able to introduce James Stafford to you this evening. James is currently an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Columbia, having completed his doctorate in the University of Cambridge in 2016. Before coming to New York, James held prestigious postdoctoral fellowships in universities of Oxford and Bielefeld in Germany. And he's published widely in the fields of modern Irish, British, European history, with a particular focus on the history of political ideas, which he places in a kind of global and transnational context. James is the author of several important articles and essays, including in leading journals, including Modern Intellectual History and the Historical Journal, which he incredibly managed to do while also co-editing a journal, the journal Renewal between 2015 and 2020. But his talk this evening is based on his new book, which is just out this year with Cambridge University Press, and it's entitled The Case of Ireland, Commerce, Empire and the European Order, 1776 to 1848. Now, I won't attempt to summarize this really groundbreaking piece of scholarship in detail, but I would like to say a very brief couple of words about the kind of historian that James is and the kinds of questions which animate his highly original, thoughtful, and I think deeply arresting scholarship. I would start by saying, first and foremost, James is a historian of ideas with a razor-sharp eye for argument, for subtlety, for nuance across several languages. And I mean languages in a philological sense as well as in the sense of political languages. Sources for his book were written, which covered the topic of kind of the state of Ireland in the late 18th and 19th century, were written in German and French as well as English, so covering a wide range of source bases there. At the same time, I glanced at the bibliography of James's new book, reveals a tireless commitment to archival rigor and research. I would say, in a nutshell, his work profoundly broadens our understanding of Irish history by placing it in a European and global framework of ideas. And this in itself could not be achieved, I think could not even be conceived of, without a deep and enduring immersion in contemporary debates and ideas which cross territorial boundaries, cultural boundaries, and of course linguistic boundaries as well. To put it plainly, it's one thing tracking down, as I know myself, as many people in the audience do, rare, sometimes obscure publications in an effort to reassemble complex pamphlet debates and political controversies. But it is James's ability to connect and to clarify, to argue and to imagine through these diverse sources, which has made a work of the scale and originality and ambition possible. This is reflected in also in the kind of conceptual toolkit that James draws on, as much as his ability to zoom out from an insular view of Ireland, placing it on what we might think of as a kind of European dissecting table of ideas during a long period of the Age of Revolution and war that characterized Europe and the wider world from the 1770s up to the 1840s. His emphasis in particular on the notions of sovereignty and commerce, which you of course will be hearing more about shortly, served to kind of decenter to some extent hetero-dominant themes of, for example, religion and nationalism, which have arguably, I think, tended sometimes to particularize our view of the Irish past in some significant respects. But these concepts, these ideas allow us to sidestep some of the, I think, unnecessary and sometimes kind of blinkering dualisms which have in the past dogged Irish history, Irish historiography of the late 18th and 19th century in particular. And I'm thinking here of those binaries, those dyads of, Ireland as colony in exclusive terms versus ancien regime European country, or Ireland as a European nation state versus Ireland as an imperial possession, and so on and so forth. By focusing with a kind of razor-sharp clarity on new themes, fresh themes in contemporary intellectual debates, James has pioneered what we might term a rich and nuanced kind of both-and approach to Ireland and Irish history. And in doing so, I think he's very deftly and skillfully and originally sidestepped, and I would say transcended all the all too familiar kind of either-or pitfalls, narratives, binaries, almost straitjackets of Irish history. The big winners from all of this, I would say, is not only Irish history, though. As James definitely demonstrates, the wider field of European and global history of ideas benefits as well, as Ireland, in a sense, through James's work, he takes its kind of rightful place in many ways at the centre of these this exchange, or if you like, intellectual exchange of ideas, where Ireland is kind of subject and object. As the French diplomat, parliamentarian, and social investigator Gustave de Beaumont, who was one of the many European intellectuals very interested in Ireland, which James has very closely engaged with, as Gustave de Beaumont wrote in 1839, Ireland, quote, "Ireland is a little country, through which the greatest questions of politics, morality, and humanity are debated." Well, embracing de Beaumont's observation in its fullest sense, James's work on the place of Ireland in European debates about empire and sovereignty, about wealth creation, and about trade and commerce have a great deal of import to contemporary debates in our society. James is going to talk, I'm sure, touch on that in his talks. But I would just say, crucially, the significance and the subtlety of these ideas and debates only become legible to us from a 21st century perspective through the eyes of a historian as skilled as James is, who has worked tirelessly to reassemble a history of the past ideas in many ways in their own terms and in their own context, sympathetically, also critically, in a way that frees them perhaps from the assumptions or the prejudices of retrospect, the condescension of posterity, we might say, the blindness sometimes of teleology. And this is, in my opinion, actually the single greatest challenge that faces all historians, all those interested in historical research. As both historians of Ireland and those interested in Irish history, I believe we are therefore extremely lucky to count a scholar of James's talent and caliber and skill amongst us. Well, quite apart from anything more I could say, James's work speaks for itself. So without further ado, I'll hand over to James.
Oh, well, gosh, I really don't know. I really don't know what to say now. I'm speechless. How can what I'm going to say now possibly live up to all of that? But I'll do my best. So thank you to Glucksman Ireland House, to Dr. Hession, Professor Kenny, for this really kind invitation and such a warm introduction, which I'm still recomposing myself here. It's a real honour to be speaking with you all today at the first in-person event here in 2.5 years in this beautiful renovated building, the beating heart of Irish American cultural and intellectual life in New York City. For me, as a British-born historian, come to New York, it's just a fantastic thing to be able to do it. It feels wonderful. So I'm going to be talking, as Pete's already explained, about a period of Irish history that many of you will be familiar with, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, before the famine, the era of Grattan's Parliament, of the United Irish Rising, of Daniel O'Connell, and the Young Ireland movement. And this is a storied time in Irish history, one that gave rise to many modern Irish political traditions and ideologies in essentially recognizable forms: Catholic constitutional nationalism, revolutionary republicanism, loyalism, unionism. But it was also a tumultuous era in global history, witnessing the rise and fall of a French continental empire and the rise of a British colonial empire that by the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 had gained vast new territories in the Indian subcontinent, East Asia, Australasia, North America and the Caribbean, while informally penetrating the collapsing Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires of South America. My book, The Case of Ireland, is about the complex interaction between Irish, British and continental European responses to this extraordinary period of conflict and transition. And as Pete's explained, it's a history of ideas, one that tries to understand Ireland's role in the making of European liberalism, which I understand as being profoundly shaped by imperial and economic thought, as well as by more familiar themes like individual rights, democracy, and constitutionalism. Now, in an Irish context, we're all familiar with these questions of sectarianism, of nationalism, of identity as being central themes in the Irish history of this period. And these themes still dominate the literature on events like the 1798 Rising and the British-Irish Union of 1801. But if we look at what many Irish people were doing and saying in this period, and what British and European contemporaries were saying about Ireland, we find that Ireland was implicated in a whole set of different questions, at times related to those familiar themes, but also distinct from them. Did the rise of commercial society, as it was termed, the emergence of increasingly dynamic and urban market economies in Europe, entail forms of political and social reform that challenged existing dynastic and aristocratic hierarchies? Could the British Empire, already by the middle of the 18th century, the leading colonial and trading power in Europe, convert that economic advantage into an ability to politically coerce other European states? And was there an alternative to the excesses of what the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith influentially termed the mercantile system, the monopolistic, exploitative model of empire that was powerfully associated with Britain really down to the middle of the 19th century? The coming of free trade is a very late event. So what the people in my book are interested in, whether they're British, Irish, French, Swiss, German, or Italian, is about whether there are alternatives to a rapacious, warlike, unequal model of mercantile empire represented by late 18th century Britain. And from this perspective, the American and French revolutions, which had a huge impact on Ireland, that's well known, that's well researched, they take on a new significance, not just as democratic revolutions in the sense of Palmer, but as responses to the threat of British commercial and colonial hegemony and rejections of the unequal and aristocratic political and economic system that was associated with it. And these questions of aristocracy and inequality had an obvious bearing on Ireland, where Enlightenment thinkers like Smith and Edmund Burke had identified the Anglo-Irish settler class as an unnatural elite, sustained not by the deferential sentiments that had built nobilities and aristocracies in the rest of Europe, but a system of political and religious exclusion that we now know as the penal laws. They're of a piece too with British liberal criticisms of the mercantile system, as well as the anti-slavery movement. Criticisms which have sometimes been styled as anti-imperial, but which I think are better understood as calls to change the nature of empire rather than to abolish it. So in this talk tonight, I'm going to focus on the contributions made by Irish thinkers and politicians to this European debate about commerce and empire. And these were articulated under conditions of political struggle and motivated, I want to suggest, by a search for different kinds of sovereignty, different kinds of political autonomy, political freedom, under conditions created by the American and French challenges to British economic and military power. And they were also linked to this question of inequality and the distribution of property and privilege within Ireland, the reform or the abolition of Protestant ascendancy. The Anglican settler aristocracy who dominated the politics of 18th century Ireland and whose colonial mission of improvement, of cultivating Irish industry and agriculture did so much to shape the aspirations of Irish nationalism, really all through the 19th and 20th centuries as well. So I'm going to be examining three moments in the history of Irish politics and political ideas, and reframing them in terms of this European problematic of commerce, empire, and economic inequality that I've laid down here. First, the volunteer movement of the 1780s, which I interpret as an attempt to reform British Empire and Ireland's place within the British Empire in the wake of the American Revolution. Second, the United Irishmen of the 1790s, which I interpret as an attempt to bring down British Empire through alliance with France and to use French power to dismantle Anglo-Irish aristocracy within Ireland. Finally, in the arguments for Irish land reform made by the Young Irelanders Thomas Davis and James Lincoln Lalor in the 1840s, an attempt in the absence of any plausible challenger to British power in Europe by the 19th century to develop a new definition of Irish national sovereignty, rooted in the soil and in the national territory, that grew out of an alternative French-inspired political economy, challenging the free market ideology of Britain's emergent free trade empire of the high Victorian era. And what's striking about all of these, in many ways quite disparate political movements, is that they assert a claim to Irish autonomy, to Irish sovereignty in the economic realm, through what the volunteers call free trade in a very specific sense, or through the rights of property as articulated by Young Ireland. So what's at stake is the political freedom to shape how Ireland can relate itself to an emerging global economy in the shadow of the British Empire. So I want to start with an illustration of that ideal, drawn from the era of the volunteer agitations against Irish commercial and constitutional subjection over the decade following the American War of Independence. So this is a print, quite a well-known print, attributed to William Hincks, who was a Waterford-born artist and printmaker. It dates from the late 1770s and celebrates the concession of free trade to the Irish kingdom, then a separate but subordinate realm under the British Crown and within the British Empire. Hibernia, the central figure, steps forward, arms raised, waving the banner of free trade, backed up, attended, as the caption reads, by her volunteers, the two men in the back left corner. And she steps forward to receive the riches of the world, from Europe, from Africa, from the Americas, as the horn of plenty lies at her feet. So this is an image of freedom and of triumph. It's an image also of welcoming, of being inducted into this cornucopian world of goods. But there's also a hint of subjection in the way the figures kneel. So this is a striking image of free trade as a marker of political liberty, of self-government. Free trade, as I say, in the sense of choosing how Ireland interacts with the rest of the world, rather than the free trade we associate with the kind of laissez-faire doctrine of Victorian Britain or of contemporary neoliberalism. And this extension of free trade to a principle of self-government was achieved in its fullest form in 1782 with the repeal of the British Declaratory Act, the 1720 legislation that suborned the Irish Parliament sitting in Dublin to the commercial legislation of its equivalent Westminster. An association with free trade in this Irish sense and political liberty and sovereignty was a very old one in Irish political culture by this time. It went back nearly 100 years to the philosopher, MP and lawyer William Molyneux's Case of Ireland being bound by Acts of Parliament made in England, stated, first published in 1698, but really becoming a literary hit and a phenomenon in Ireland in the 1770s, around the time of this amputation of Irish free trade. And there Molyneux had complained that the imposition of commercial legislation by Westminster had rendered Ireland a mere colony on the level of the North American or the Caribbean colonies, not a co-equal realm in a British multiple monarchy. Now, this insistence that the self-regulation of trade was a condition of being part of an English empire of liberty was something that even radical English Whig supporters of the American cause in the 1770s found hard to take. They insisted that an imperial tariff policy required an authority, required Westminster to set those rules. So the question of how Ireland could practice free trade while still being part of the British Empire, loyal to the British Crown, with a friendly relationship to the British Parliament, is a kind of conundrum that haunted both Irish and British politics through the 1780s. So I think it's key to understand this Irish ideology of free trade is Molyneux's conviction that the relationship between the realms of England, or actually Britain, and Ireland was governed by something called the law of nations. So this early modern conception of a set of rules and customary practices that governed the relationship between sovereign states. And what Molyneux and his later followers in the volunteer and patriot movement do is assert that those principles also need to apply to the kind of intra-imperial relationship between Britain and Ireland. So Molyneux's Case of Ireland used an example drawn from the 17th century Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius about the injustice of exercising political coercion for the control of markets. The English, Molyneux asserted, had no right to use the threat of violence to coerce the Irish out of their success in exporting woolen cloth, England's staple export, in the markets of Europe. That's the grounds of this old trade dispute between the Irish and the English parliaments. So this is an idea of empire as a kind of permeable political form, and that Ireland could practice a kind of commercial neutrality or independence within it, but this could be still reconciled with allegiance to the British Crown, and crucially, going back to this image, to participation in the fruits of the colonial empire that the British constructed, of course, with a great deal of assistance from Irish land and material in the course of the 18th century. And in the context of the War of American Independence, this claim can be backed up by a threat of outside intervention. The European balance of power affected the balance of the Irish constitution. Popular and patriotic forces within Ireland were emboldened by the threatening geopolitical context to make their bid for power against the entrenched oligarchy of the Dublin Castle administration. And in doing so, they were altering then the balance of political power between Britain and Ireland. Now, free trade in this Irish sense appeared to many British observers to be something contradictory. The Irish, as I've claimed the right to trade with British colonies on terms equal to the metropole, but also that they were an independent trading nation, able to evade British mercantile regulation when it suited them when dealing with other nations, especially the newly independent United States. And there's a lot of kind of geographically inspired speculation about how much easier it is to sail to the west coast of Ireland than it is to sail to London or to Bristol, that you can save a couple of days off the trip, and that if you add that up over many trips, that makes for a significant geographical advantage for Irish ports vis-a-vis their British competitors. And these kinds of speculations prompted this acid comment from the Anglo-Irish parliamentarian John Holroyd, first Earl of Sheffield, who was an opponent of Irish patriot politics and a supporter of Lord North. Some of these pretended friends of Ireland, he wrote in a pamphlet of 1785, have been driven by the absurdity of their pretension into the most contradictory mode of reasoning. For on some occasions, they treat her, Ireland, as a separate kingdom, not only independent, but utterly unconnected. On others, they claim her as a part of the empire, entitled, according to an inauspicious phrase, to a reciprocity of equal rights. For the sake of fairness in argument, it is to be wished they choose one predicament or the other. Always when I'm reading this, I kind of hear the exasperated tones of the European Commission official dealing with Brexiters. It's a kind of very parallel kind of problem. So there's a have your cake and eat it problem. Nevertheless, the strength of Irish opinion behind this idea of Ireland as enjoying a kind of sovereignty of trade is such that the British respond by attempting to make a commercial treaty with Ireland, explicitly modelled on the kind of treaties they had with other European states like Portugal, and then later in the 1780s with France. The commercial propositions of 1785, proposed by William Pitt and strenuously opposed by Sheffield, attempted to combine access to British imperial markets with acceptance of British commercial regulations. Now, the propositions were regarded by the British ministry as a kind of irresistible offer, but they were rejected in Ireland for two reasons that related to the ways in which they violated this principle of independent Irish legislative control over trade. The first was that they required the Irish Parliament to agree in advance to future laws made by Westminster, something that violated this principle. But secondly, and more interestingly, I think, because of doubts within Ireland that this privileged access to the British commercial system was a fair price to pay, that maybe there were better options elsewhere. And the 1780s were an era of fevered speculation, not just by the Irish, about the economic potential of Ireland as an entrepot for trade with the newly independent American states, but also with the colonies of other European empires, particularly France, whose sugar colony of Saint-Domingue was at this point starting to outproduce all of the British Caribbean slave plantations. So maximizing Ireland's wealth through its own trade policy could also be reconciled with the principle of imperial loyalty. It's what the Irish Whig playwright Richard Sheridan called rivaling Britain in affection. So the idea is that Ireland kind of goes off and makes its own money on its own terms and then throws it into the imperial pot. But there's also a more radical hope expressed by figures like Etienne Clavière, who's an exile from Genevan revolutions of the early 1780s, that Ireland would become a free port, would open its markets to the world, evade entirely the mercantile system of Britain, and displace London as the centre of Atlantic trade, thereby dissociating world commerce from British power, placing it in the hands of a neutral and politically unambitious polity like Ireland. And Clavier makes this case to the Chancellor of the Irish Exchequer, John Foster, who was one of the big proponents of the 1785 agreement in Irish politics, though he was later a strong opponent of the Union of 1801. And again, we have a description here of Ireland's economic function in the world economy, which rings, which is very resonant. The real winners of the game are those that furnish the room, the carpet, cards. Voila, the role of Ireland in the great game of commerce. Nature indicates it to her. Her ports are easier, safer, and better dispersed than those of Holland. You must, in a word, have among you the great market for the exchange of the productions of Europe with those of the Indies. Culture, commerce, and navigation on foreign accounts. Here is an inexhaustible source of riches and employment. So Clavier's example of Holland is instructive here because in the 18th century, after its grand period of colonial expansion and conquest in the 17th century, Holland has largely adopted a policy of neutrality in the European alliance system and is indeed one of the most consistent practitioners of neutral commerce all through the 19th century, even into the First World War. So what Clavier is evoking there is a dream of Irish autonomy that allows profit from a modified version of the colonial system, while also reforming and changing Britain through the workings of economic competition, but in a sense, Irish competition is going to punish and discipline the protectionism, the monopoly, the militarism of the late 18th century Britain. Now, needless to say, this dream was never realized. Divides in the volunteer movement over the question of Catholic enfranchisement, quite significant in the middle of the 1780s for taking the wind out of this moment. But it was also upstaged by the Franco-British Commercial Treaty of 1787, which signalled a kind of rapprochement that then diminished Ireland's importance as a handmaiden for British commercial reform. But the return of war to Europe after the French Revolution reignited and radicalized Irish movements against this conception of British mercantile empire and added to it a radical critique of aristocracy in the form of Anglo-Irish ascendancy. I'll turn to that now in the form of the United Irish. So the United Irish revolutionaries, most famously in the case of Wolfe Tone, are known for their commitment to an Irish independence and Irish democracy above sectarianism, despite their controversial alliance with Catholic defenders. But the United Irishmen also sought what one Irish rebel called a very different system of political economy when taken before a British parliamentary inquiry and asked what the United Irishmen intended to do. I think it's Emmett who says this, who intended to bring a very different political economy to Ireland. And this is evidenced by the kind of materials that Tone was bringing with him to distribute in Ireland in the event of a successful landing at Bantry Bay in 1796, a line from an address to the Irish peasantry that was intended to be distributed. At this hour, almost all the lands in France are, as they ought to be, the property of those who cultivate them. Those who before the revolution were no better than slaves, like yourselves, are now become substantial proprietors. Now here the United Irishmen were following a French script for revolution that had already been laid down in the early 1790s, the so-called abolition of feudalism. This is a French print celebrating the abolition of feudal dues and obligations, but crucially also of categories of property law. So central to this was primogeniture, the inheritance of landed property by the firstborn, but also entailed settlements, so legal mechanisms through which large landed estates were protected from being broken up by sale or indebtedness. And these measures to consolidate and protect landed power were outlawed in a series of pieces of French legislation in the early 1790s, enshrined in the Code Civil of 1794, and in the form of then the Napoleonic Code Civil of 1802, applied by the Napoleonic Empire across the Low Countries, the Rhineland, and northern Italy. And this French abolition of feudalism was an instrument of Republican foreign policy, of French expansion. The famous revolutionary motto of war against the chateau, peace to the cottages. And it was paralleled in Ireland by the United Irish assault on the property monopoly of Protestant ascendancy. And this was central to the radicalism of a very central figure in my book, but one who's still, I think, underweighted in histories of the United Irishmen, Arthur O'Connor, who came late to the movement, but was a key emissary in 1797 to 8, so between Bantry Bay and the 1798 Rising. So in the plan for revolution mapped out in O'Connor's 1798 manifesto, the State of Ireland, the first act of a constituent assembly on the French model representing the Irish nation would be to make primogeniture and entails, these feudal laws consolidating landed property, illegal. And it would thereby, sorry, I've changed the slide. So, it would thereby bring down Protestant dominance of Irish landholding by bringing land into market circulation, rather, I should say, than enabling the kind of vengeful, spontaneous repossession that was demanded by the Bardic tradition and by the Catholic working class defender movement. So this is very much a strategy for kind of managing this transition in a way that can keep order in a revolutionary situation and backed by French arms. France, O'Connor argued, was uniquely placed to act as Ireland's protector as it underwent this transformation into a sister republic, a member of a permanent French-led alliance system that would ultimately produce perpetual peace in Europe after the commercial power of Britain had crumbled. O'Connor insisted that France was a new sort of world power, one that aimed not at universal dominion, but in a pacified Europe whose political institutions were in accordance with the progress of commerce and enlightenment. France's turn to partitive inheritance for all the offspring of a family receiving equal shares in its property was described by O'Connor as a policy of nature, and one that would ensure that it would never act as part of a conqueror or exploiter of Ireland. Now, this is a very specific kind of radical reading of property law as being, absolutely kind of determinative of the politics of a given regime, which is maybe quite foreign to us. But it came from a radicalized reading, again, of Adam Smith. So O'Connor regarded British mercantile empire as the product of the political corruption of an aristocratic ruling class by merchant interests that profited from their vanity and luxury consumption. So it's a kind of vicious cycle. The mercantile system is sustained by the consumption of aristocracy. And thus it also protects aristocracy, produces a kind of social stasis that results in a militaristic and expansionist power. I mean, in a sense, it's a kind of proto-theory of imperialism on a Marxian model. So speaking of France, O'Connor argued that her interests were so clearly marked out that they cannot be mistaken. She has no interest to join herself to any coterie for the support of the miserable remnant of feudality that still loiters in Europe. In France, those great causes I have mentioned had their effect, and the great predisposing law that establishes this free circulation of property, upon which liberty is firmly placed, is in perfect unison with the popular spirit that pervades the mind of Europe. So as this suggests, O'Connor, alongside other United Irish exiles like William James Nevin, who fled after 1798, first to France before coming to New York, had become, in a sense, not just advocates of an Irish cause, but propagandists for French empire. They're making the case that the continental conquest of Europe and the social reforms introduced by the Napoleonic regime are in alignment with the common interest of all the nations of the continent, including Ireland. And when McNevin, writing in the Napoleonic Moniteur, is making a case for a further French invasion of Ireland that never happened in 1803-4, he really emphasized this question again of commercial neutrality. At this point, Britain was attempting to blockade France and French-occupied areas, searching and intercepting ships of neutral countries like Denmark, at this point Russia. McNevin's argument is that this represents a kind of naval and mercantile imperialism, which is much more dangerous than the actual physical conquest of Europe that was being undertaken by Napoleon at that very moment. So it's an attempt to restyle Napoleonic conquest as a kind of defensive war against British commercial empire. So what McNevin and O'Connor represent, I think, is a radical intensification of the critique of British Empire advanced by Anglo-Irish patriots and volunteers in the 1780s, one that makes commerce and colonialism a function of a corrupted domestic political system. So the response to this is not just a demand to reform the terms of Irish trade, but a wholesale dismantling of Irish and British political systems and the establishment of French reforming hegemony across Europe. So Irish autonomy, the construction of an Irish republic, is only possible amidst a wholesale refashioning of the entire European order under French leadership. So that Irish autonomy, that Irish independence goes together with the French alliance. It goes together with a durable transformation of European politics along French lines. So I want to turn finally now to young Ireland 40 years later. It's clear that the fall of Napoleonic Empire is a terrible development for Irish radicals like O'Connor, who lives out the rest of his life in France. Great power collaboration to fix Europe's borders and keep the peace after the Congress of Vienna ends the kind of formal Franco-Irish radical collaboration that we saw in the 1790s and 1800s. Indeed, despite recurring tensions, Franco-British collaboration, particularly in imperial spaces like South America or later China's treaty ports, is one of the linchpins of 19th century order. In the first part of the century, then, particularly before the rise of Irish America as a factor in Irish nationalism, this was a bleak conjuncture for those who were impatient with the parliamentary techniques of petitioning, of mass meeting associated with that economy. But this didn't mean that the discourse of Irish sovereignty went away. It was relocated instead to an imitation of what was termed by then the French system of political economy, founded on peasant proprietorship, and championed in the context of the Young Ireland movement in the Nation newspaper by Thomas Davis. And a reactivation of that French model of constituent power of the nation meeting to establish its fundamental laws in order to bring about that radical land reform by James Fintan Law, advocated, demanded in the advancing shadow of the famines of the mid-1440s. So Davis, as is well known, was one of the founders of the Nation newspaper, but intellectually, I argue, it functioned as a conduit for francophone ideas about political economy into the mainstream of Daniel O'Connor's repeal movement in the 1840s. In his 1839 essay, Feudalism and Feudalism, Davis redescribed the partitive inheritance laws of the French civil code as an example of the ancient Irish practice of gavelkind, the sharing of property within and beyond generations of a family. And he emphasized that the gavelkind was the historic custom of all peoples who hadn't been subjected to the historic ordeals of conquest and what he terms landlordism, the profit-seeking farming system of England. So, nationalism is often associated with particularism, but Davis's move is actually to say that gavelkind is a universal property form and landlordism is a kind of aberrant English perversion that is a passing phase. So it's a clever kind of inversion in the sense of colonial universalism. So restoring Irish property to its original feudal state, freely held by those who work it, required an emulation of the French Revolution, brought about by the free decision, crucially, of patriotic Anglo-Irish landlords to turn over a portion of their lands to their tenants. And there's a precedent here for the kinds of land reforms that happened all over revolutionary and post-revolutionary Europe, not just in France, but also in Prussia. The key analogy, though, is still the land legislation of the French, and there's a kind of extraordinary quotation from this essay that I'll give you to have a flavour of this. So the revolution came, Davis wrote, with its tremendous legislation to repeal the deeds of all the conquerors of France, Celtic, Roman, and Teutonic, came with torch and sword to enlighten and destroy, to smite and to save, came with confiscation to the noble and feudalism to the peasant. Strange, unconscious antiquarians were Mirabeau and Danton, so these leading French revolutionaries, who treated primogeniture and landlordism as vulgar novelties and restored the land to the people. So what Davis is doing here is telescoping the kind of ancient foundations of Ireland's true property order into an alternative European modernity represented by contemporary France. Davis's model of commercial society was founded on domestic artisanal labor in the home and access to the land, rather than the wage labor and the confinement to factories, which was by then associated with Britain's advancing industrial system. So for people like Davis, kind of the emergence of the factory system kind of into the already kind of corrupt and disorderly framework of aristocracy and mercantile empire is something that signifies its end is nigh. There's simply too much that is unnatural and wrong about this British model of capitalism for it to endure. So Davis reappropriated an essentially francophone critique of British political economy. Writing 5 years later, as the potato blight swept through Ireland, James Fintan Lalor, young Ireland's most ardent, unorthodox advocate for a new popular agitation behind the land question, drew a bitter parallel between famine and revolution as constitutive moments in the histories of Ireland and France. The failure of the potato, he wrote, and consequent famine is one of those events which come now and then to do the work of ages in a day and change the very nature of an entire nation at once. It has already produced a deeper social disorganization than did the French Revolution, greater waste of life, wider loss of property, more of the horrors with none of the hopes. For its direction still seems dragging downwards, while her revolution took France to the sun, gave her wealth and victory and renown, a free people and a firm peasantry, lords of their own land. So Lalor's analogy between the French Revolution and the famine was a consequential one for how he then constructed his conception of an appropriate response to the emergency. Ireland's social constitution had collapsed, and in those circumstances, a clear original right returns and reverts to the people, the right of establishing and entering into a new social arrangement. So in response to the famine, Lalor attempted to construct a constituent assembly, again, this model of constituent power, of a representative group that can speak for the nation and framing its fundamental laws, that would concede control of Irish land to its tenants. that would adopt the programme of Ulster tenant right that the law championed at meetings across Ireland during the famine years. And in a flourish typical of young Ireland's inventive conflation of Irish antiquarianism and French revolutionary precedent, the law invoked the process of surrender and regrant instituted by the Tudor conquerors of Ireland. So this, when the armies of Elizabeth I and then of James I kind of advanced into Munster and to other areas of the Irish interior in the middle of the 16th century, they would created a kind of legal fiction whereby the Gaelic chieftains of those areas held their lands with the permission of the English crown. So it's a kind of process whereby the ultimate ownership of property changes, but its occupation does not. And the law constructed the idea of an oath of fealty being taken by Ireland's Irish landowners to the nation, this island queen, as he put it. So replacing Queen Victoria with the Irish territory, so making that the basis of political allegiance. And if they swore this oath of allegiance, they could continue to hold the land that they held, but with the obligation to share it then with the occupiers. So Davis had presented this Udall property as a historic fact that had been recreated in revolutionary France by the actions of its National Assembly. The law, by contrast, believed it to be a present Irish reality, one that had been long obscured by the laws of landlord property, but which was now being revealed by the catastrophe of the famine, which showed, in a sense, where power in Ireland really lay or where it should lie. And of course, this discourse of national and territorial sovereignty over land was to prove its potency 2 generations later in the Land War, which represented a new kind of Irish counterpower, but one backed crucially then by the diasporic support of Irish America as well. We live in this recent work and other things are shown. So Ireland has a rich tradition, I've suggested tonight, about thinking through the interactions between the global balance of economic and political power and projects of social and political transformation at home. And I think that's a tradition that resonates today as we contemplate the new conversations that are starting up in Ireland about reunification with the North, but also about the Irish state's economic model and whether it's really delivering for most Irish citizens, especially the young. And as much as Irish nationalism has been associated with a rigid and inflexible commitment to absolute sovereignty over the whole island, we think of the language of Pearse in the 1916 proclamation, what we see in all of these movements is in fact a much more subtle, a much more sophisticated and gradated understanding of what it means to be a self-ruling, a self-governing society in a world of interdependence, but also of inequalities of power. We've seen how multi-layered conceptions of empire, British and French, as well as the self-governing autonomy of landlords and tenants, could become ways of advancing the case of Ireland, even under the worst of conditions, the total defeat of Irish political initiatives, the pitiless suffering of the famine. And indeed, this very adversity, I think, which produces the kind of perceptual inventiveness that I've been talking about tonight. And this is still a set of questions that matters. How does a political community that's not a great power, that's not even fully sovereign, navigate the balance of power and the distribution of power within a global economy? That's the challenge that these Irish thinkers and politicians are dealing with. Sovereignty, they recognize, is always something that is affirmed and negotiated through our relations with others under conditions that are not of our choosing. And that's something, that as a British subject, I have to say, my own society and political culture seems to have catastrophically forgotten. But it's something that the history of Irish political thought, in all of its many varieties, can teach the world.
So, James, I'm hoping you'll take a few questions.
Sure. I don't know whether I went on.
No, perfect, thank you. I think the best way to do this, given we have challenges with the acoustics, would be if you repeat the question from the microphone, and then everybody will hear. Thank you.
James, hi, John Waters, here at That's terrific stuff. So I've already read good pieces of the book, but this mode of framing the argument was delightful and really informative. It provokes a couple of different ways of trying to grasp the through lines that you separate out into these sort of three case studies. But of course, to me, those raise issues about timelines, right? Because I find that some of what you suggest about the Irish critiques of the British manufacturing system and of sort of the British commercial mode in the third instance are actually present in the second. Right? They're present in the United Irish Movement, they're present in the early 19th century. There are a number of figures in Irish, operating within Irish print culture, who have a very well articulated critique of the British commercial system and the social formation that it presupposes. And I'm also connected as well to the Gaelic, to the sort of remnants of the sort of Gaelic order and the kind of critiques that we associate with 18th century remnants Gaelic political thought, right? So there's one question there, and that leads into some specific ones about thinking about timelines and when the idea of the empire is settled in the way that your analysis seems to suggest, right? So for me, one of those is just about the presence of liberalism as an ideal for the transformation of Irish society before the critiques of British system were actually fully in place, right? So somebody to me, I haven't looked at the book to see if it treats someone like Samuel Crumb, an essay on the best means of providing employment for the people from 1793, a very influential essay about thinking of how to create a functional Irish employment system, an Irish really transformation of national character in order for liberalism to work, right? For sort of that's a fairly sophisticated critique of the idea that the British system of colonial control in Ireland has wrecked the possibility in Ireland for the development of the kind of society that would otherwise be desirable, right? And that critique is shot through the United Irish Movement. It's in Walter Cox's United, Whitey Cox's magazine, right? Which also has a very sophisticated critique of empire. So too does it when he's here in New York, where the British manufacturing system is being opposed from an Irish American perspective in 1817, 1818, 1819, and in the depressive years after the end of the war. The same is true. I guess the same kind of question about chronology would come up thinking about Nevin in writing in 1803 in France, which I have not seen that. I'm very curious about the essay that you're referring to. Is that written in French?
Yes, it's published in the Monitor, but it's republished, interestingly, kind of 10, 15 years later in New York.
In pieces?
I think it's an appendix to pieces.
Appendix pieces, yeah. So but there too, the problem of the fact that the French model just disappears as a workable idea, right, would also seem to suggest that. I'm not sure if there's a question that I'm posing.
Yes.
What I'm trying
may I, in my need to reformulate the statements anyway for people to hear and for the recording, maybe I could put it this way: is that there is an important kind of intermezzo through the later Napoleonic years that my talk tonight has skipped out on, but which is present in the book. And indeed, there's a discussion of Walter Cox in the book and the Irish magazine. And that's also relevant to Samuel Crump, who, for those who may not know, who is a Limerick physician who wins the Royal Irish Academy essay competition in 1793 on the question of what are the best means of promoting employment in Ireland, and that's very much in a context shaped by the militia riots of the French Revolution and fears about the problem of order in Ireland as well. And I mean, as I understand what Crump says in that book, it's partly about the relationship between agricultural improvement and manufactures within Ireland. And that Crump, like all Irish improvers, is quite kind of holistic in what he thinks should happen. But he actually draws on Smith to say that Ireland clearly has a comparative advantage in agriculture. And that the potato diet, in fact, is an asset in this because it enables, it's such an efficient staple crop that it enables those notorious grain exports to Britain, which then becomes such an object of derision and anger through the famine years. And this model of Ireland as a kind of complementary agrarian breadbasket to an industrializing Britain is one that a lot of Irish improvers really take on around the turn of the 19th century, because it's a model that seems to work. The landlord rents are rising, and that money is in some places being plowed into things like improved roads and canals. And then Walter Cox, as you say, so this kind of, so he was an informer within the United Irishmen who became this kind of very successful literary entrepreneur in the 1800s before being driven out, pensioned off and sent to South America as to disrupt it. But this Irish magazine, it's very important. Guy Viner has written about it as a kind of repository for Irish Catholic memories of the 98. And then this speaks to the aspect of your question about the Gaelic dimension to all of this. But yeah, that articulates really a kind of dependency theory kind of account of how Ireland is locked into being this agrarian dependency of Britain, and that all of these roads and canals and the other things that are being invested in are all just conveyor belts for extraction. They're not leading to any durable prosperity or development that could be associated then with Irish political autonomy. So it's very much a kind of idea that this agrarian turn within Ireland that people like Crump are championing is actually not going to bring about the kinds of political respect and independence that Ireland deserves. And then, yes, I think on the question of, I mean, obviously, I think in a sense we see a little bit of a tense relationship both in the United Irishmen and in Young Ireland to things like white boyism or the Rockite movement that which Pete is very authoritative on, but which, to my mind, kind of represents a sort of articulation of communal laws that are being enforced through violence and the threat of violence at a very granular level. And in a sense, these large-scale legal reforms by both the United Irishmen and Young Ireland are meant to keep a lid on that. And it's not until the land war, obviously with a much more consolidated and respectable tenant class than early 19th century Ireland had, that you sort of get this kind of meeting in the middle of this, elite discourse of legal reform and these popular practices of boycott and landlord discipline. It takes the new departure to get you there.
James, thank you for this wonderful lecture and for the hook at the end concerning sovereignty, absolute and other. I have a couple of questions, and they really they go from the lecture to the book because, of course, we're celebrating the launch of the book this evening as well. The first question is, this may go beyond your research agenda and may just open up a research topic for somebody else. This evening, your protagonists have been mostly Irish.
Yeah.
In the book, you have French and German intellectuals reflecting on Ireland. And I wondered when I was reading the book if there was an American dimension to this in the sense of Americans reflecting on the case of Ireland. I don't know quite who they would be as an intellectual class, but you gave us a clue this evening because the question formulated in my mind was if O'Connor and McNevin are advocating, if you like, a French model of liberty and empire in the United States. Who's listening? Is anybody listening in the United States? In other words, does this have a resonance in American political economy, American intellectual circles? I have no idea of the answer to that, so I'm just curious. The second question, related, and again, because we're celebrating the book, is a simple one, and that is, did you write the book you intended to write?
Well, so yes, so two questions there about American reflection on Ireland during this period, and whether there's a kind of influence on American discussions of political economy, and then yes, whether I've written the book I intended to write. I guess that sort of depends on when the intention falls. I mean, the dissertation was initially just going to be about 1780s, 1785, so in a sense, sort of coming back and spending so much time on that now was good. But it was actually after reading Gustave de Beaumont, this French kind of sociologist that visited Ireland and wrote this huge book, not quite as long as the 2 volumes of Democracy in America, but very much a companion piece to Democracy in America. De Beaumont was Alexis de Tocqueville's kind of close friend and collaborator that made me think, well, I have to go firstly into the 19th century, and I have to go deeper into why someone like Gustave de Beaumont would write such an extensive book on Ireland in the 1830s. And so de Beaumont and then Adam Smith really ended up being sort of two, I'd say they're the two sort of tentpoles of the book in terms of how I came to writing it. But it is, I guess if you say I started writing after the dissertation, then the answer is yes. On the other question about American observation of Irish circumstances, so I think in a sense, another really central figure who links all of these different realms is Thomas Paine, who's the one, Smith is quite cautious, quite ambivalent in his politics. It's Paine that kind of rams through a kind of radical reading of the Wealth of Nations that says, no, actually, you have to dismantle the aristocracy. Smith's not actually sure that societies can function without aristocracies. So he dies before being able to make a judgment on the French Revolution. So in that sense, through Thomas Paine, you have an obvious American resonance, and also through this kind of Jeffersonian small voter feel. But I'm not sure that that's formed by observation of Ireland. I think obviously there are American causes for that. In terms of the American system of manufacturing protection, there is a very clear influence through McNevin, but also through Matthew Carey, who is the son of a patriot polemicist against Britain, an agitator for protective tariffs in Ireland in the 1780s. This is one model that I didn't talk about in the lecture, but there's a movement for Irish protective tariffs against British imports as one consequence of free trade. The full menu of economic policy is potentially on the table. So his son is Matthew Carey, that we associate with the American system of political economy and with the protectionist movements of the 1830s and 1840s. So there's a very clear lineage there.
Great lecture. My name's Beth Abbott. So when you mentioned at the end about how really this movement really reverberates today, especially the photo that you had of the Homes for All, the housing crisis is such a huge problem today in Ireland. And actually this morning, I was reading an Irish Times article, ironically, about reverse culture shock when you come home from studying abroad. And it cited a survey that said more than 7 in 10 young Irish people are considering emigrating today because of issues, and primarily housing. And so the Irish government has to once again, it would be a tragedy for immigration, for another wave like the 1980s to happen again. So my question is, what from this period, from the 1700s to the 1800s, if there's one big lesson that the Irish government should keep in mind right now while they're dealing with this? What would it be? I mean, I know that's very. I just.
You know, I vote for myself after this.
Yeah.
Well,
Or-
no, I think to consider it as a global problem. You know, that a lot of what is now driving the kind of exponential increase in house prices and rent is the financialization of property in Ireland. And this is something that happens, you know, I just moved from Berlin. That's also somewhere where, and it's also a huge phenomenon in the United States, where you have these huge index-linked funds are buying up places that people live. So, you know, I'm not going to advocate a new land war to stop that, but I would say that it's not. It has to be considered in the round as part of the way in which Ireland is integrated into the European local economy, and also really for, I think, for Irish activists in that field. I'm sure this is happening already, but you know, about linking up between different places where rent and property ownership are a problem. Berlin is a strong example. The UK is also an example of this. So that in terms of the activism around it, that too is transnational and not only directed to an Irish context.
Thanks, James. Yeah, about this talk, I was kind of tantalized by your book ending, literally, and your talk ending as well with the 1840s. So I wonder if I could just ask a few questions on our just 2 points. The first is I really love, and I actually have this for my students, the Lawler piece comparing the famine to the French Revolution from, I think, March 47, very perceptive. And I suppose the first question would be, you know, I was intrigued, I think, at the conclusion of your book, you and I never knew this, that John Stuart Mill writes after the 1860s, after the Fenian Rising, he says, oh yeah, well, it actually would have been better for Ireland, famine wouldn't have happened if the United Irishmen had won. And he justifies that explicitly on peasant proprietorship, which of course he's coming around to, and it's going to become an African island via Bright, and then it's of course that's going to be mainstreamed and it becomes a dominant policy in the late 19th century. And I just wondered, I suppose, well, I should know this myself, but like thinking of the radicals, I know Russell had policies for peasant proprietorship which didn't make it, but a policy, I think radical policy did make it, was the Encumbered Estates Act. Which is a very radical policy either. I was talking about this only yesterday to a class, talking about, you know, the ownership of land in Ireland being 0.1%. So, you know, we talk about the 99.9%, the 0.1%, but, you know, 1/7 of the land of the 0.1% did change hands in this quite dramatic and radical move. Of course, it was also dramatic and radical to the massive proletarianization that was, you know, result of the Gregory Clause, the chaotic immigration, the mass deaths, all the rest of it. But a weak government attacking landowners in Ireland in that kind of way, in a way that, you know, what did the Encumbered Estates do? It swept away with some of the other legal instruments. So kind of a massive act of administrative radicalism, sort of no literature really always. So, you know, a life upon our property seen in that context. And that occurred first, that the Encumbered Estates, that an attack on landlords occurred before the idea of peasant proprietorship, you know, is interesting to me. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then the second thing is just about the future trajectory of young Irelanders, given that they go off into the empire, take an imperial term, several of them, and then experiment precisely with these kind of concepts of sovereignty and empire in Australia and other places as well. So, and even thinking of a figure like Mitchell, you know, so where some of this thinking is this continental inspired thinking kind of takes us later on. So I guess two kind of annoyingly later 19th century questions really about the next step on from your the next period of your research. So, you know.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pete. You know, I was born ever further forward in time. So yeah, the first question was about the Encumbered Estates Act, which was a piece of legislation that enabled indebted Irish landowners, particularly in the west of Ireland, to have their debts expunged so that the estates could be sold on, which was championed, was instituted by a Whig government, but also championed by Robert Peel, notoriously as a new settlement of the North. And I think that description kind of speaks to what I understand is the difference between a scheme like that and the kind of peasant proprietorship schemes based on partitive inheritance, which is that it's fundamentally about the problem of getting capital into Irish agriculture to enable so-called high farming on an English model. It's not about distributing ownership so that reliance on wage earning is reduced. So that to me is the fundamental difference with the peasant proprietorship model. So it's very much in the mold of British political economy, which regards the accumulation of capital in agriculture as the determining factor for productivity, which is, you know, a contested view, remains a contested view in the literature. In fact, I should be reviewing a book which essentially argues that this was a made-up ideology that damaged English agriculture quite a lot. So that I think is the difference. And then on where the young Irelanders go, I mean, yes, I think you can see why someone like Mitchell, who is attached to really two things: a kind of critique of British liberal economics inspired by Thomas Carlyle, who is, you know, both someone who writes quite movingly and effectively in an inspirational way for socialists on the social question in England, but someone who is also kind of biological racist. This can lead Mitchell to a position where he's opposed to British liberalism and all its works, and that includes abolitionism, that includes anti-slavery in the American context. And, you know, when also then is kind of championing of the Confederacy in his writings for the Southern Citizen, who moves to Tennessee from New York. Again, we can see a kind of political orientation that, you know, given the Confederate rhetoric about autonomy, about federalism, about self-rule at a lower level than the national polity, you can see again how an old repealer might transition into taking that position in an American context.
Thank you. I think this question maybe something you've already begun speaking to in that last response, but I was struck throughout the talk about this tension or seeming tension between policies or ideas that are fairly egalitarian in other English those that seem a little bit more as if they're advocating for Ireland to have a seat at the table. So that image of Hibernia almost seems as if, you know, Tanya has stepped out of the center and Hibernia has stepped in or and so I was curious if you could say a little bit more about how various interlocutors are talking about that. Even if they are right, framing it in egalitarian terms, the sort of global market that they're trying to have access to is one fundamentally at the moment deeply based on various kinds of inequality and domination of populations. And if that comes up as something that can be very probably you might not see but other
Thank you for that, Ren. So you were asking about going back to this image of Hibernia, the kind of global inequality that's implied by Ireland's demand to participate in a colonial trading system, and how that's in tension with the kind of domestic ideals of equality that some of these movements espouse, particularly the United Irishmen. And I think, you know, this is something I write about in the book, that I think the United Irishmen are actually sort of subtly split on this question. So Tone is someone who talks a lot about the need for an Irish flag, an Irish navy. He's writing at one point letters to William Pitt about a colonization scheme for what's now Hawaii. So he's someone who's really on the sort of seat at the table for Ireland spectrum. But then precisely because the United Irishmen are so much part of the kind of broader culture, particularly Presbyterian radicalism in Ulster, they also have strong anti-slavery and abolitionist current. And, you know, something that I think to qualify any judgments on Tone being a kind of crypto-colonialist, Thomas Russell, his close friend and collaborator, is a very vocal abolitionist. And indeed, in a text I talk about in the book but didn't mention tonight, Russell says that the justification for Irish rebellion is that the British are fighting the Haitian Revolution, and are thus implicating all Irish soldiers and consumers in the slave trade and the consumption of sugar. And then obviously abolitionism is also something that carries into Daniel O'Connell's political career. There, I think, though, there's a question, you know, that obviously abolitionism isn't, in the British imperial context, isn't, you know, straightforwardly emancipatory. It's also something that as you know, as we know, is something that justifies British intervention and the extension of British power, particularly in Africa, but also in South America. So it has this kind of disciplinary aspect to it as well, that, you know, slavery is in some ways replaced by indenture systems, and that this is a much more mixed picture after the 19th century. So I would put O'Connell more at that kind of British liberal end of the anti-slavery spectrum, and Russell as someone with more insurrectionary politics. But more broadly, and this goes back to Mitchell, you know, one of the things Mitchell says about the famine is that it's happening to white people, and this is particularly shocking. And that the British are willing to pay to emancipate their slaves with the huge loan they take out to indemnify the Caribbean planters. But they're not willing to borrow in similar amounts to bankroll famine relief in Ireland. And I think what all of these, I think a European identity is important. I don't think it's necessarily a white identity. I think that's something that comes later, and particularly in the American context, but it is a European identity, a claim to be part of the European society of nations that's governed by the law of nations, at a time when that European identity is becoming stronger, becoming more clearly defined and more differentiated. We start getting the idea, really in the early 19th century, this is something that Pitts has written about in her history of empire and international law, that there are different standards that apply outside of Europe. But that's still kind of an emerging conception. That's kind of that point. But I do think that there's Irish participation.
So we will wrap up. We in Ireland have been looking forward to this evening for a long time to finally open our doors. We said we'd do it before the refurbishment is complete, before the pandemic has quite gone away. Just a couple of things upcoming. If you go to our website, you can see our calendar events is now live. This time next week, we'll have a lecture on populism in Irish culture and literature. Another coming, Dan Mulhall, the former ambassador to the US, is actually with us this semester teaching. Will give a lecture on Ulysses. Normally, I would now invite you downstairs for a reception. I can't do that this evening, so James will always associate you with our grand reopening. Thank you so much.